She almost got away with it. Stacey Castor wanted the world to believe she was cursed by tragedy, a husband dead from a heart attack, a second husband poisoned by his own hand, a daughter driven to suicide. But investigators say it was all a lie. Behind the grief was a chilling truth. The grieving widow was actually a calculating killer, now known as the Black Widow. This is a story of betrayal, manipulation, and a mother who nearly got away with murder. Join me as we unravel this web of lies and deception. Stacey Ruth Daniels, later known as Stacey Castor, was born on July 24, 1967, in the quiet suburban town of Clay, New York. Her parents, Jerry Daniels and Judy Eaton, raised her in what seemed like an ordinary, working-class household. By all accounts, her childhood was stable, unremarkable, and free of the kinds of trauma that often shadow darker stories. Friends and family described Stacey as a bright, inquisitive child. She wasn't the type to sit quietly and accept things at face value. She wanted to know more, to dig deeper, to ask questions about everything around her. Her mother, Judy, would later recall that Stacey's curiosity was so relentless, she had to set playful limits. Judy said, "She was such a curious child, always asking questions. I finally told her I'd only allow her 3 Ys a day." That's how Stacey's mother, Judy, remembered her daughter. A little girl full of curiosity, eager to understand the world. But as Stacey grew older, that curiosity and determination would take a much darker turn. Stacey Daniels was just 17 years old when she met Michael Wallace in 1984. To her, it felt like love at first sight. Michael was 6 years older, born in 1961, and he quickly became the center of her world. Friends and family described Michael as easygoing, generous, and the life of the party. He was the kind of man who could light up a room with his humor and warmth. Stacey herself would later say that Michael was the type of person who, if you asked him for something and he had it, he would give it to you. That generosity and charm made him well-liked, and it was part of what drew Stacey to him so strongly. By April 1990, Stacey and Michael were married. The ceremony wasn't extravagant. It was held at home, surrounded by close family and friends. It was intimate, simple, and heartfelt, reflecting the modest, working-class lives they were building together. Not long after, they started their family. Their first daughter, Ashley, was born in 1988, even before the wedding, and their second daughter, Bree, followed in 1991. To outsiders, they looked like a typical young family. Michael was especially close to Bree, while Stacey often described Ashley as her best friend. Together, they seemed to balance the bonds of parenting, even if there were subtle tensions beneath the surface. But married life was far from easy. Michael worked nights as a mechanic, while Stacey worked days as an ambulance dispatcher. Their opposite schedules meant they rarely saw each other, often passing like ships in the night. On top of that, money was always tight, and the stress of raising 2 children weighed heavily on them. Michael also struggled with drinking, a problem that grew worse over time. What may have started as casual drinking became more frequent, and it began to affect both his health and his relationship with Stacey. The combination of his drinking, their financial struggles, and their clashing schedules slowly eroded the marriage. Rumors of infidelity on both sides only deepened the cracks. By the late 1990s, Stacey was reportedly thinking about divorce. The marriage that had once felt like destiny was now strained and fragile. But before she could make any decisions about leaving, Michael's health suddenly took a turn. Toward the end of 1999, he began to fall mysteriously ill. His family noticed the changes, but no one could have imagined just how serious it would become. And it was here, as Michael's sudden illness worsened, that the story of Stacey's dark legacy truly began to unfold. Michael's health was visibly deteriorating. He complained of dizziness, weakness, and feeling drunk, even when he hadn't been drinking. His family noticed he was coughing often, seemed unsteady, and at times looked swollen. One moment in particular stayed with his daughter Ashley. She later recalled watching her father suddenly sit up, vomit across the coffee table, and then lie back down as if nothing had happened, drifting back to sleep without a word. To a 12-year-old girl, it was frightening, but she had no idea it was the sign of something far more sinister. Just a few weeks later, on the morning of January 11th, 2000, Michael's mysterious illness reached its tragic end. Ashley was at home, sitting in the living room watching television, when she noticed her father lying on the couch. At first, she thought he was just resting. But when she tried to wake him, she realized something was terribly wrong. Michael was unresponsive. Emergency responders were called, but it was too late. At just 38 years old, Michael was pronounced dead. Doctors told Stacey that he had suffered a heart attack. Michael's family, however, wasn't convinced. His sister and others pushed for an autopsy, pointing out how unusual his decline had been. But Stacey refused. She insisted that the doctor's explanation was enough for her, and she didn't want her husband's body disturbed. With that, Michael was buried without further examination. In the aftermath, Stacey quietly collected on Michael's life insurance policy, which was worth about $55,000. Instead of using the money to stabilize her family's finances or secure her daughter's future, she spent it quickly. Reports later revealed that she used the payout on personal expenses and luxuries, moving on with her life as though the tragedy was behind her. But in truth, Michael's death was only the beginning of a much darker story, one that would take years to unravel. After Michael's sudden death, Stacey didn't remain single for long. About a year later, in 2001, she met David Castor, a hardworking businessman who owned an air conditioning installation and repair company in upstate New York. At first, David seemed like the opposite of Michael. Where Michael had been described as fun-loving and easygoing, David was known as serious, disciplined, and work-driven. Friends and colleagues described him as a man who valued responsibility, stability, and providing for his family. Stacey herself would later say that David represented support, strength, and security in her life. Their relationship progressed quickly. Stacey began working as David's office manager, and the two grew close both personally and professionally. By August 2003, just 2 years after meeting, they were married. Their wedding was more formal than Stacey's first, a step up in stability and status, reflecting David's established career and financial security. But David didn't come into the marriage alone. He had a son from a previous marriage, David Jr. This created a blended family dynamic. Stacey brought her 2 daughters, Ashley and Bree, while David had his son. According to later testimony, David's relationship with Stacey's daughters was complicated. He tried to be a stepfather figure, but there were tensions, especially with Ashley, who was very close to her mother and sometimes clashed with David's stricter personality. On the surface, Stacey and David's marriage looked solid. They worked together, shared a home, and presented themselves as a stable couple. But beneath that facade, problems began to emerge. Stacey's daughters reportedly felt that David could be controlling at times, and David's own son would later express bitterness when he was cut out of his father's will in favor of Stacey and her girls. The marriage also carried the same strain Stacey had faced before: long work hours and growing emotional distance. Stacey and David argued, sometimes bitterly, and while David was described as hardworking and reliable, he was also stubborn and not easy to live with. By 2005, just 2 years into their marriage, cracks in the relationship were becoming harder to ignore. Arguments escalated, and Stacey would later claim that David had been depressed after the death of his father. Whether that was true or not, it set the stage for what would soon become another tragedy. On the morning of August 21, 2005, the tension finally boiled over. The couple got into a heated argument, one that Stacey later said dragged on for hours. By the end of it, David was furious. He stormed into the master bedroom, locked the door behind him, and refused to come out. According to Stacey, he stayed in that room for nearly an entire day. She later told police that David had been drinking heavily and was depressed over the recent death of his father. Friends and family, however, would later say that Stacey didn't seem overly concerned. Instead of calling for help or checking on him, she claimed she simply left him alone, saying he needed space. By the next afternoon, August 22, 2005, Stacey said she still hadn't seen or heard from David. That's when she finally picked up the phone and dialed 911.
Police Communications, can I help you?
My name is Stacey Castor. My husband didn't show up to work this morning. I don't know what's going on. I'm just getting a little concerned because I haven't talked to him since 5 o'clock in the morning on Sunday when he locked me out of the bed.
In a panicked voice, she told the dispatcher that her husband had locked himself in their bedroom the day before and hadn't come out. She said she feared he might have hurt himself. When deputies from the Onondaga County Sheriff's Office arrived, they forced open the locked bedroom door. Inside, they found a disturbing scene. David Castor was lying naked on the bed, already dead. On the nightstand beside him sat a half-full glass of bright green liquid, antifreeze mixed with something sweet. Under the bed, officers discovered an empty bottle with the cap off a container of antifreeze. At first glance, it looked like a suicide. Stacey, who was present when police entered, screamed, "He's not dead! He's not dead!" Her reaction struck some officers as oddly performative, more dramatic than genuine. But as detectives examined the scene more closely, troubling details began to emerge. In the kitchen trash can, they found a turkey baster. On the tip of it was David's DNA, and inside were traces of antifreeze. Investigators theorized that David had been too weak to drink on his own, and that Stacey had used the baster to force the poison into his system. Even more damning was the glass of antifreeze on the nightstand. Forensic testing revealed Stacey's fingerprints on it, positioned in such a way that it looked like she had held the glass from the bottom, as if lifting it to someone else's mouth. Then came the issue of David's will. Detectives discovered that shortly before his death, David had signed a will leaving his entire $300,000 estate to Stacey and her daughters, completely cutting out his only son from a previous marriage. This raised even more suspicion. Why would a devoted father disinherit his own child? David's ex-wife flatly rejected the idea that he had killed himself. She told investigators that David was not suicidal, and that the story Stacey was telling simply didn't fit the man she knew. His son, David Jr., was devastated, not only by his father's sudden death, but also by the fact that he had been left with nothing. He later said he believed Stacey had manipulated his father and stolen his inheritance. Piece by piece, the picture was shifting. What at first looked like a tragic suicide was beginning to look like something far more sinister. To detectives, Stacey was no longer the grieving widow. She was now their prime suspect. Detective Dominic Spinelli of the Onondaga County Sheriff's Department never bought Stacey's story. From the moment he walked into the bedroom where David was found, something about the scene felt staged. The glass of antifreeze, the turkey baster in the trash, the will that cut out David's son, it all pointed to a setup. As Spinelli dug deeper, he uncovered something chilling. Stacey's first husband, Michael, had also died suddenly just 5 years earlier. Even more unsettling, Stacey had arranged for Michael and David to be buried side by side in the same cemetery. Investigators decided to watch her closely. They set up surveillance cameras outside her home and even at the cemetery, hoping to see if she visited the graves of her two husbands. Strangely, she never did. At the same time, detectives wiretapped her home phone, listening in on her conversations. They wanted to know what she was saying when she thought no one was listening. But the most decisive step came in September 2007, when investigators made the bold decision to exhume Michael's body. It had been more than 7 years since his death, but forensic science still had answers. When the medical examiner examined his organs, the results were undeniable. Michael's body was loaded with crystals, the telltale sign of antifreeze poisoning. Spinelli later said that in that moment, he knew, we had a double homicide, and Stacey probably killed both her husbands. 2 days later, Stacey was brought in for questioning. Detectives pressed her about the glasses found on David's nightstand. Spinelli asked casually, "Do you remember which glass you poured the cranberry juice in?" Stacey looked at the evidence and replied, "Well, when I poured the the cranberry juice." The slip was damning. She quickly backtracked, accused Spinelli of trying to frame her, and demanded an attorney. The interview ended abruptly, but her anxiety was obvious. When Stacey returned home, detectives were still listening. On the wiretap, they heard her making multiple frantic phone calls to friends. She sounded nervous, unsettled, and desperate to know what investigators were saying about her. The surveillance, the exhumation, and her own words were closing the noose. To Spinelli and his team, Stacey Castor was no longer just unlucky in love. She was a calculating killer who had poisoned 2 husbands and was now scrambling to cover her tracks. In September 2007, detectives went to Ashley Wallace's college on what was supposed to be an ordinary day, her very first day of classes. They sat her down and told her something that shattered her world. Her father, Michael, hadn't died of a heart attack back in 2000. He had been murdered with antifreeze. Shaken and confused, Ashley did what any daughter would do. She picked up the phone and called her mother. On the wiretap, detectives listened as Stacey comforted her daughter, asking what the police had told her. Then Stacey suggested something unusual. "We've had a hard day. Why don't you come home, and we'll have a drink together?" Ashley later recalled that she thought it was strange, but also exciting. She was only 20, and her mother, who she still considered her best friend, was giving her permission to drink with her. What teenager wouldn't think that was awesome? Ashley said years later. That night, Stacey mixed her daughter a drink. Ashley remembered it tasting odd, but she trusted her mother. After finishing it, she quickly became lethargic, then passed out in her bedroom. The next day, Stacey invited Ashley to drink again. This time, Ashley noticed the cocktail tasted even worse. She hesitated, but Stacey handed her a straw and told her to put it to the back of her throat and just swallow. Ashley later said she thought maybe drinks were supposed to taste bad. So she did as her mother told her. Once again, she felt overwhelmingly tired and went to lie down. But this time, she didn't wake up. By the following morning of September 14th, 2007, Stacey's younger daughter, Bree, walked into her sister's room and found a terrifying sight. Ashley was lying in bed, completely unresponsive, her breathing shallow and weak. Panicked, Bree ran to her mother. Stacey picked up the phone and dialed 911.
I need an ambulance.
What's the problem?
My daughter has taken some pills. Sounds like there's something in her throat. Ashley. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God.
By the following morning of September 14th, 2007, Stacey's younger daughter, Bree, walked into her sister's room and found a terrifying sight. Ashley was lying in bed, completely unresponsive, her breathing shallow and weak. Panicked, Bree ran to her mother. Stacey picked up the phone and dialed 911. On the call, she told the dispatcher that Ashley had been drinking and had taken quite a few doses of medication. But what struck investigators later was how Stacey seemed more focused on something else. In the middle of the call, she made sure to mention that there was a typewritten letter in the room, a supposed suicide note. When paramedics arrived, they found Ashley barely clinging to life. Doctors later said she was just 15 minutes from death. The note beside her bed appeared to be a confession. Ashley supposedly admitted to killing both her father, Michael, and her stepfather, David, and now wanted to end her own life. But when Ashley finally woke up in the hospital, she was stunned to find detectives waiting at her bedside. One of them told her about the suicide note, that it claimed she had murdered both men. Ashley's reaction was immediate. Wide-eyed and confused, she said, "I did not try to kill myself. I didn't write any note. I don't know anything about this." She flatly denied killing her father or her stepfather. To detectives, her shock and insistence rang true. And soon, forensic evidence would back her up, proving that the so-called suicide note had been typed on Stacey's computer while Ashley was at school. When detectives recovered the 750-word suicide note beside Ashley's unconscious body, it looked at first like a confession. The letter rambled on without punctuation, supposedly written by Ashley, admitting to killing both her father and her stepfather before attempting to take her own life. But investigators quickly noticed problems. The note contained the same odd misspelling Stacey often made, writing antifreeze instead of antifreeze. That detail alone raised suspicions. Then came the forensic breakthrough. When police examined Stacey's home computer, they discovered that the suicide note wasn't a single document. There were multiple drafts of it saved on the hard drive. Even more damning, the computer's timestamps showed that the drafts had been typed while Ashley was away at college. It was impossible for Ashley to have written them. The only person with access to the computer at that time was Stacey herself. This evidence made it clear. Stacey had not only poisoned her daughter, but had also tried to frame her for the murders of both men. On September 14th, 2007, the very same day Ashley was rushed to the hospital and barely survived, detectives moved in. Stacey was arrested at the hospital. She was formally charged with second-degree murder for the poisoning death of her second husband, David Castor. Second-degree attempted murder for trying to kill her daughter, Ashley Wallace. Forgery for altering David's will to cut out his son and leave everything to her and her daughters. Although she was never formally charged with the murder of her first husband, Michael, his exhumation and the antifreeze evidence were presented at trial to show her pattern of behavior. The trial of Stacey Castor began in January 2009 in Onondaga County, New York. It would last 4 weeks, with the jury deliberating for 4 days before reaching a verdict. Throughout the proceedings, Stacey's mother, Judy Eaton, stood firmly by her daughter. She told reporters and the court that she simply could not believe Stacey was capable of such crimes. They were blaming Stacey for this. I went hysterical. I cannot believe Stacey has it in her to kill 2 men, especially men she was supposed to love. And she would never frame Ashley. Judy's unwavering support created a striking contrast with the evidence piling up against Stacey. Led by District Attorney William Fitzpatrick and Assistant DA Christine Garvey, the prosecution built a case that was, in Fitzpatrick's words, a forensic dream. They presented forensic computer evidence. The suicide note had been written on Stacey's computer while Ashley was at school. Multiple drafts were found, proving Stacey authored it. Forensic linguistics. The note contained Stacey's signature misspelling of antifreeze as antifree. DNA and fingerprints. David's DNA was on the turkey baster, and Stacey's fingerprints were on the antifreeze glass. Medical evidence. Both Michael Wallace and David Castor's autopsies showed calcium oxalate crystals in their organs, the hallmark of antifreeze poisoning. Fitzpatrick told the jury that Stacey was motivated by money and control, willing to sacrifice anyone, even her own daughter, to protect herself. He described her as being at the ceiling of evil. Stacey's attorney, Chuck Keller, tried to shift suspicion back onto Ashley. The defense argued that Ashley had been responsible for David's death and had then attempted suicide out of guilt. They painted Ashley as troubled, rebellious, and capable of violence. But this strategy backfired. The jury saw Ashley not as a killer, but as a survivor who had narrowly escaped her mother's plot. Detective Dominic Spinelli, who had pursued Stacey for years, testified about the investigation. He recounted,
I took this picture of one like it out of my folder, and I showed it to Stacey and said I had a question for you. Stacey, regarding these glasses that were on top of the nightstand next to David's bed, you told us earlier that you had gotten David some cranberry juice and some water. By looking at the photo, would you be able to tell me which glass it was that you brought into David? Stacey leaned into the photo, was looking at it, at which time she said, when I poured the antifreeze, the cranberry juice, you're confusing me, you're jumping all over the place. At that point I said, Stacey, I simply asked you one question. I didn't jump all over, it was just one question, if you know which glass it was.
Stacey's suspicious slip during questioning. When I poured the antifreeze, the cranberry juice. The surveillance of her home and the cemetery. The exhumation of Michael Wallace and the discovery of antifreeze crystals. Spinelli's persistence and calm, methodical testimony gave the jury a clear picture of Stacey's pattern of deception. The most emotional moment came when Ashley took the stand. She was the prosecution's first witness, and she testified tearfully about how her mother had invited her home for drinks, how the cocktails tasted strange, and how she trusted her mother completely. Ashley told the jury, I did not kill my father. I did not kill David. I did not write that note. The last thing I remember was my mom making me a drink. Her testimony was devastating. The jury saw her as a victim, not a perpetrator. Fitzpatrick later said he couldn't imagine sitting in Stacey's place, hearing his own child say, "You tried to kill me." Ashley, who had once called her mother her best friend, was forced to reconcile the unthinkable. That same mother had tried to kill her. In interviews, Ashley admitted to feeling torn. I hate my mother for ruining so many people's lives. I never knew what hate was until now. Even though I do hate her, I still love her at the same time. She testified that she would have done anything for her mother, but Stacey chose betrayal instead. On February 5, 2009, after 4 days of deliberation, the jury found Stacey guilty of second-degree murder of David Castor, second-degree attempted murder of Ashley Wallace, forgery of David's will. A month later, she was sentenced to 51 years to life in prison, effectively ensuring she would never be free again. After her conviction in February 2009, she was sent to Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women in New York, the state's only maximum security prison for women. Inside, Stacey maintained her innocence. In interviews, she insisted, "I did not kill Michael Wallace. I did not kill David Castor. And I did not try to kill my daughter, period. And I will never say that I did, ever." But outside the prison walls, her daughters were left to pick up the pieces. On June 11, 2016, just 7 years into her sentence, Stacey Castor was found dead in her prison cell at the age of 48. The official cause was a heart attack. She never saw her daughters again. In the end, Stacey Castor was remembered not as a victim of fate, but as the Black Widow, a woman who betrayed love, family, and motherhood itself. Yet out of that darkness came survival. Ashley and Bree Wallace endured the unthinkable, losing their father, their stepfather, and then discovering their own mother's betrayal. Their strength is the final chapter of this story, a reminder that even in the shadow of unimaginable cruelty, resilience can endure. If you found this deep dive compelling, please like, share, and subscribe for more true crime investigations. And tell us in the comments, what do you think about this case?